Among the swamps and bayous, marshes and forests that sit at the mouth of one of the largest river systems on Earth, sits a state unlike any other. It's a cultural melting pot, sitting in the deep south, home to one of the largest black populations in the country, and more culturally connected to and shaped by France than any other state in the US. It's the home of Cajuns and Louisiana Creoles, and its food and traditions are famous around the world. Dominant in the energy industry, at the same time it is one of the most impoverished places in the country, and with significant parts of the state lying at or below sea level, it faces major threats from floods, rising seas, and natural disasters. Louisiana's culture, history, geography, and society is vastly different from anywhere else in the country. The little state at the mouth of the Mississippi occupies an outsized role in the American imagination. A world away from even its neighbors, Louisiana is a unique and fascinating state, and is the 19th place I will cover in the US Explained, a 56-part series on every state, territory, and federal district in the country by order of admission. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. This is the US Explained, episode 19, Louisiana. According to the Köppen climate classification, the entire state sits in the humid subtropical climate zone, with hot summers, mild winters, and humidity. Louisiana is very lush and rainy. It has the highest average precipitation of any state in the country, getting 59.15 inches of precipitation on average every year. The next three states on that list all also sit on the Gulf of Mexico. The entire state is located squarely within the central time zone. Louisiana is nicknamed the Pelican State because brown pelicans are common in the swampy state's coastal areas. The bird has become a common symbol of the state and is featured on Louisiana's flag. The flag is technically a state seal on blue background design, but I think it is one of the best of that category because it's simple, recognizable, and unique. It shows a mother pelican feeding 3 baby pelicans in a nest. Interestingly, she's feeding them with her blood. Underneath the nest is a banner reading Union, Justice, Confidence. I think it's a nice flag, and considering the pelican is such an iconic symbol of the state, it represents it well. The name Louisiana was given by René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, a French explorer. La Salle named it after French King Louis XIV, who ruled France when Louisiana was claimed for it. Its name is just one example of France's significant influence on the state. Louisiana is the first state I've covered that sits on the Gulf of Mexico. It's the westernmost state I've covered so far, the southernmost I'll cover in a while, and the first state I've covered in a long time that doesn't border a state I've already made a video on. As a part of their French heritage, the state is broken into subdivisions called parishes, essentially counties by a different name, but it makes it just one of 2 states along with Alaska that doesn't have counties. In terms of land area, Louisiana is towards the middle but on the smaller side, taking up 43,204 square miles or 111,897 square kilometers. It sits at 33rd out of the 50 states. Though not that small as states go, it's smaller than all of its neighbors and is the smallest state in the continental US west of the Mississippi if considered west of the river, where most of it lies. In terms of both population and population density, it's almost exactly in the middle. It's 25th out of the 50 states in population, home to 4.66 million people, more than Kentucky but less than Alabama. With a fairly average population and land area, Louisiana has a very average population density as well, at 26th out of the 50 states, with 108 people per square mile, or 41.6 per square kilometer. Home to a major city and a number of smaller ones, and at the same time significant swamps and wetlands that are difficult to inhabit, a combination of geographic advantages as well as challenges gives Louisiana a fairly average population density. Louisiana is located in the south-central part of the country and is part of the geographic and cultural region known as the South. Along with Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, it's one of the 5 states that make up the Deep South. Culturally and historically, Louisiana shares a lot in common with its fellow southern states, especially its Deep South neighbors. However, within the country and even within its region, it's always been something of a cultural island. Its location at the mouth of the mighty Mississippi made it an important port city, an early population center, and a destination of migration and settlement. Historically controlled by a number of different empires, it's been shaped and influenced by all of them, especially France. For example, in the heavily Protestant South, it has one of the largest Catholic populations in the country. On top of that, the state's swamps and bayous have left many regions in the south of the state geographically isolated from parts of the north, allowing groups like the Cajuns to develop fairly separate from the rest of the state and country. Louisiana borders 3 other states and sits on the Gulf of Mexico. Texas sits to the west, Arkansas to the north, and Mississippi to the east. The Gulf of Mexico sits to the south. Because Louisiana is shaped almost like the letter L, much of the southeastern part of the state, home to major cities like New Orleans and Baton Rouge, sits to the south of Mississippi and to both the north and west of the Gulf of Mexico. The border between Louisiana and Texas follows the swampy Sabine River north. The Texas cities of Beaumont and Port Arthur sit not far from the border near the river's mouth, and Houston's only an hour and a half away. Across the border, East Texas shares a number of cultural and geographic similarities with Louisiana, both covered with forests and swamplands and home to large Black as well as Cajun populations. And you can find similar food in both regions. Toledo Bend Reservoir, the 4th largest reservoir in the country, sits on the Sabine River and the border cuts through it. Just north of the reservoir near the town of Logansport, the border leaves the river and moves north for about 70 miles or 113 kilometers until it turns east, becoming the border with Arkansas. The Arkansas border is a straight east-west line which heads east for 166 miles or 268 kilometers until it reaches the Mississippi River. Across the river lies the state of Mississippi. The river has historically changed its exact course many times, as it straightened out and turned former bends into oxbow lakes. Despite the river changing course, the original borders remain, and because of this, Louisiana at times sits on both sides of the river, and at times Mississippi reaches across. Large Mississippi towns like Vicksburg and Natchez sit across the river from Louisiana. Just south of where the Mississippi meets the Red and Atchafalaya rivers, the border leaves the river and moves east, leaving the rest of the Mississippi within Louisiana. Its 2 largest cities, New Orleans and Baton Rouge, are both on the east bank of the river, and Louisiana is the only state to really straddle the river other than Minnesota, home to its headwaters. The Mississippi-Louisiana border moves east for 111 miles or 179 kilometers until it reaches the Pearl River. It then follows the river south to its mouth at the Gulf of Mexico, not far from where Lake Pontchartrain meets the Gulf. Other than the Pearl, Sabine, and some smaller rivers that flow into the Gulf in southern Louisiana, most of the state lies within the watersheds of the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers. The Red River to the south, whose watershed reaches all the way into New Mexico, flows through Texas and Oklahoma before entering Louisiana from Arkansas. The river cuts from the state's northwest corner southeast to the Mississippi. It used to meet with the Mississippi, but today most of it flows into a river called the Atchafalaya. In Louisiana, as the Mississippi flows through very low, flat-lying land on its way to the Gulf, its waters at times branch off into other rivers, branches, and bayous. Bayous are essentially a slow-moving channel of water common in Louisiana due to its flat land and all the water coursing through the state from the Mississippi. The largest of the branches that splits off from the Mississippi is the Atchafalaya. In fact, 30% of the water in the entire Mississippi watershed doesn't flow through the river's mouth, but instead leaves the river, flowing into the Gulf through the Atchafalaya. This makes the river, which is only 137 miles in length and is entirely contained within Louisiana, the 6th largest river by discharge in the entire country, with more water flowing through it than the entire Missouri River. Surrounding it is the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest river swamp in the country. The Atchafalaya is actually an easier route to the sea, and because of that, the Mississippi in recent years has been trying to naturally change its course and divert its waters through it instead. However, New Orleans and Baton Rouge, Louisiana's 2 largest cities, sit on the Mississippi downstream, as do the 1st, 7th, 9th, and 10th busiest ports in the country. If the Mississippi changed its course, it's no exaggeration to say that it would destroy the state's economy. On top of that, people downstream the Atchafalaya Basin would likely need to be evacuated as the water flow through the river would increase drastically. Because of this, the Army Corps of Engineers built floodgates regulating water flow into the Atchafalaya to prevent the river from changing course. Despite this, it's likely to eventually change course anyways. The Atchafalaya Delta is the only part of the state's coast that is growing, due to all the sediment being deposited there from the river, while much of the state's coasts and wetlands are disappearing as sea levels rise. Louisiana is very flat. Sitting on the coast and far away from any major mountains, it's among the flattest states in the country. Its average elevation of 100 feet above sea level is higher only than Delaware and is tied for 2nd lowest with Florida. Its highest point, Driscoll Mountain, is only 535 feet or 163 meters above sea level, the 3rd lowest highest point of any state. And it's one of just 2 states, along with California thanks to Death Valley, whose lowest point is below sea level. This lowest point is actually in New Orleans, parts of the city sitting as much as 8 feet below sea level. These low-lying areas in the city and further south around the coast and the river's delta are often protected by levees, earthen walls that have been built to prevent the river and the sea from spilling down into lower-lying surrounding areas. The river, in many places in Louisiana, sits above the land around it, a very strange phenomenon. Breaches of these levees by Hurricane Katrina were a large part of the reason that the hurricane was so devastating in New Orleans and caused so much horrific flooding. Southern Louisiana is especially flat and marshy. Crisscrossed with canals, the land slowly subsides into the sea. In much of these marshlands, the plants, not the ground itself, are above the water. The Louisiana bald cypress is an iconic tree that often grows just beneath the water in the state's swamps, and Louisiana is also known for its iconic Spanish moss, which often hangs down from the cypress trees over the swamps and bayous. Much of this state, but especially its swamps in the south, are filled with spectacular wildlife like pelicans, turtles, great blue herons, egrets, wild pigs, and most famously, alligators. You might think of Florida when you think of gators, but Louisiana actually has more of them. It's home to 2 million alligators, the most of any state. Large bays, estuaries, and brackish lakes fill the low-lying swampy coastline. Thin barrier islands at times all that separates them from the Gulf. The largest of these lakes is Lake Pontchartrain. It's a brackish lake, a mix of saltwater and freshwater that sits just off the Gulf. Though it can be debated whether it's more of a lake or an estuary, Pontchartrain, if considered a lake, is the 11th largest lake in the United States and the country's largest brackish lake. The Mississippi River flows very close to the lake but then turns south, meeting the Gulf of Mexico in a fork-shaped delta. Due to all the distributaries that flow out of it, much of southern Louisiana is really part of an enormous delta, built up by sediments deposited from the river. This is part of the reason the state juts 90 miles further south than nearby Mississippi and Alabama. Much of this vast, swampy country is obviously incredibly difficult to inhabit, but people known as the Cajuns and Creoles have lived in this part of the state for centuries. Though most live further inland in areas that are slightly more raised and boats aren't necessary to get around, people live even in the most isolated swamps and bayous. Deep in the swamplands, you can find a surprising number of houses, often built on stilts, and accessible only by taking a boat through the many canals and channels that have been dug through it. Many people get by on fishing, and alligator hunting is even common. Because of that, many people who live way out in the swamps are almost entirely self-sufficient, and rarely need to travel into town if they don't want to. Even in less swampy areas, houses in southern Louisiana are often built on stilts because the groundwater is so high, making it impossible to dig a foundation. Most of Louisiana's largest cities sit in the south of the state. The heart of Acadiana, or Cajun country, is a large triangular plain sitting between the forest to the north, the Gulf to the south, and the Atchafalaya Basin, though the basin and the swamps beyond are often considered part of the region as well. Lafayette, in the east of the plain, is the Cajun cultural capital and the 4th largest urban area in the state, home to 252,000 people in it and its suburbs. Another small city, Lake Charles, sits on the other side of the flat agricultural plain and is the 6th largest urban area in the state, home to 143,000 people. Like many Louisiana cities, it's a major oil and gas town. Other larger towns like Opelousas and New Iberia sit in the region as well. Because it's flat and filled with water, it's one of the few places in the country where rice can be grown, and it's home to major rice industry, the 3rd largest in the country. East of Acadiana's agricultural plain sits the swampy forested Atchafalaya Basin, and beyond it, most people live either along the Mississippi River or bayous that branch off of it. To get the most of these long waterways, farms are thin and long, at times only a few hundred feet wide, but stretching back several miles to maximize the number of farms that have water access. This causes the state's agricultural regions to follow these bayous and rivers in long ribbon-like patterns, and means towns themselves are often long and thin as well, stretching along the waterways. Houma, the state's 5th largest urban area, just larger than Lake Charles with 144,000 in its urban area, sits along a number of bayous and canals among the swamps of southern Louisiana, sitting between the Mississippi River not far from its mouth and the south shore of Lake Pontchartrain, and surrounded by swamps and marshes on all sides, sits Louisiana's largest urban area, New Orleans. The famous city is home to 899,000 people in it and its suburbs, making it the largest urban area in Louisiana and the 49th largest in the United States. Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, the longest bridge in the United States and the longest continuous bridge over water, stretches for 24 miles or 38 kilometers from the New Orleans suburbs to the town of Mandeville. Other large towns such as Covington, Slidell, and Hammond all sit on the other side of the lake from the city. Further upstream on the Mississippi sits Baton Rouge, Louisiana's other major city. Home to 594,000 people, it's the 68th largest urban area in the country and is Louisiana's capital city. Away from the swampy and agricultural coastal areas, most of northern Louisiana is forested. It's still flat, though the further north you go, you'll start to see very gentle rolling hills. Agriculture is mostly confined to the areas around northern Louisiana's two major rivers, the Red and the Mississippi, which each form large belts of farmland cutting through the forest. This part of Louisiana is culturally much more like the rest of the South than southern Louisiana. Though it exists, there's far less French influence in northern Louisiana, and it's much more rural than the more heavily populated South. Much of northeastern Louisiana sits on the floodplains of the Mississippi and as such is filled with rich deposits of soil that make it an ideal location for farming. It sits across the river from the Mississippi region known as the Delta, dominated by farming in one of the most impoverished regions in the country. And northern Louisiana has a lot in common with the Delta and Mississippi in general. The agricultural plains along the river are at times even considered to be part of the region. While Louisiana overall faces major problems with poverty, the most impoverished parts of the state are located in the north of the state, especially agricultural areas along the river. Parishes like East Carroll Parish are among the poorest places in the United States, and overall, Louisiana has the fourth lowest per capita income in the country. Only Arkansas, West Virginia, and Mississippi have a lower per capita income than Louisiana. Keep in mind, two of those states are Louisiana's neighbors, making it very much a problem for the region overall as well. On top of that, the state is seeing the second lowest growth in per capita income in the country. Only Alaska, a state with an already very high per capita income, is seeing less growth in the income of its residents. Because of this, Louisiana will likely continue to fall in income rankings, perhaps eventually becoming the poorest state in the country. For example, in 2010, it had a higher per capita income than 9 other states. Now, it's ahead of just 3. Northern Louisiana is mostly rural, home to just a few small cities. Monroe sits on the edge of the wide agricultural region around the Mississippi, despite being fairly far from the river, and the Red River Valley is home to Alexandria and Natchitoches, as well as Shreveport, Louisiana's third largest urban area and the largest in the north of the state, home to 298,000 people in it and its suburbs. What is now Louisiana was originally home to a number of different indigenous peoples. Ancient peoples built massive structures like Poverty Point, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of just 24 in the country. Located in northeastern Louisiana, it's home to massive concentric earthen rings stretching more than half a mile, as well as several earthwork mounds. When Europeans arrived, the mound-building peoples had long since disappeared, and different native tribes inhabited the area. In the north lived people like the Caddo, Quapaw, Osage, Yatasi, Tunica, and Tainsa. Central Louisiana was home to different peoples such as the Natchitoches, Coasati, Adai, Natchez, and Avoyelles, and in the south lived many different groups such as the Alabama, Eshok, Opelousas, Homa, Washa, Okaloosa, Chawasha, Bayagula, Chitimacha, Acolapissa, and Choctaw. Many towns and places in Louisiana come from Native American words and names, as do words like bayou, and Native people have had a significant influence on the state and its culture. With the arrival of European colonists in the Americas, they brought with them diseases that the indigenous people had not yet been exposed to, such as smallpox. These diseases end up decimating the continent's indigenous peoples, killing 90% of them. Those that survived often died at the hands of colonists, as European settlements pushed further westward, encroaching on their land and pushing those that survived west. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore Louisiana. Panfilo de Narvaez sailed along its coast in 1528, and Hernando de Soto sailed inland along the Mississippi 14 years later. However, the first colonial power to really settle the region was France. At the mouth of the Mississippi, the entrance to much of the continent's interior, it sat at a crucial and strategic location, and for France, hoping to dominate this vast heartland of the continent, control of the river and its mouth would be crucial. France founded 3 main colonies in North America as part of New France: Acadia in what are now the maritime provinces of Canada, Canada located around the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, and Louisiana. It was founded in 1682, named by French explorer René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle for France's king, Louis XIV, and French settlers began arriving 17 years later. Louisiana included much of the continent's flat, fertile interior that sat between the Rockies and the Appalachians, but its settlement mostly consisted of fur trading outposts. Most towns were built along the river and the Gulf. Strategically important, and the easiest part of the colony to access, the area around the mouth of the Mississippi, known as Lower Louisiana, became the colony's population center. They founded New Orleans, which near the mouth of the river as well as Lake Pontchartrain, quickly grew into an important city and a center for trade. Furs and other goods from much of the continent were shipped down to the Mississippi to New Orleans, where they were then sent out to be sold around the world. In addition, agricultural areas developed along the river upstream from the city and soon became dominated by slavery. Enslaved people were shipped in from Africa, as were descendants of Africans who'd been enslaved in the Caribbean. They were forced to harvest cotton as well as sugarcane, grown in the hot, swampy wetlands of the colony. The harvesting and processing of sugarcane was particularly dangerous and brutal, and many enslaved people died while plantation owners grew profoundly wealthy, building massive riverside estates. The growth of New Orleans was in many ways tied to slavery, as plantation agriculture became massive exports, and the city was home to the largest slave market in the country, where hundreds of thousands of people were sold into slavery. The fast-growing city attracted people from all over the world. A stretch of the river north of the city became known as the German coast because so many German immigrants moved there. Spain was also not too far away. They controlled much of the Caribbean as well as Florida, and Spanish settlements like Pensacola were not far from French towns like Mobile. Meanwhile, on the Atlantic coast, British settlers were pushing west and coming in conflict with French claims in the Ohio Valley. In the 1760s, these disputes eventually broke out into the French and Indian War, with Britain fighting against France and its ally Spain, and different native tribes allied with each side. Britain came out victorious. They won Florida from Spain, Canada and Acadia from France, as well as the disputed areas east of the Mississippi River. One area that came under British control was West Florida, a stretch of the Gulf Coast from the Mississippi to the Apalachicola River. Much of it had been under French control, but as it was east of the Mississippi, it went to Britain. As they were losing the war, France became worried about the possibility that Britain might control Louisiana, and in 1762 secretly ceded the entire colony to Spain, who they knew would be friendly to the French settlers there and allow life in the colony to continue pretty much as it had before. It was a good idea, considering what happened to the Acadians. 14,000 French colonists had lived throughout Acadia, but when Britain gained control of it after the war, though some Acadians managed to hide out and survive, Britain forcefully captured and deported nearly 12,000 of them, in a violent mass expulsion that saw nearly half of the deported Acadians die. Multiple waves of expulsions, known as the Great Disturbance, occurred over the course of a decade. Many surviving Acadians fled to Louisiana, the last major remnant of New France that remained in the hands of an empire that was allied with the French, and which already had a large, successful French population. Louisiana's Spanish governor encouraged Acadians to move to the colony. They mostly fled to its rural parts, in the swamps and bayous along the Gulf. The Acadians had already been living across the Atlantic from mainland France for generations. There they developed their own culture and society, and their dialect differed distinctly from traditional French. Arriving as refugees in Louisiana, they were not only significantly poorer than many of the French colonists there, but they also didn't fit into colonial French society. They were seen by others and saw themselves more as Acadians than French. Because of this, they stuck together, settling the swamps of what is now southwestern Louisiana, a region that, isolated both geographically and culturally, became known as Acadiana. As generations went by, the Acadians of Louisiana's swamp country developed a society largely disconnected from the rest of the country, and later the state, with a unique accent, dialect of French, music, religion, and food. This transformation of Acadian society is epitomized by their name for themselves. Over time, the word Acadian transformed into Cajun. Today, the Cajuns make up a large percentage of Louisiana's population, as well as that of neighboring Texas, with around 815,000 Cajuns living in Louisiana and perhaps around 375,000 living in Texas, especially in the cities of Beaumont, Orange, and Port Arthur, which are not far from the Louisiana border and nearby Houston. The Cajuns in the region of Acadiana have their own flag, which is common in the region and is based in part off the Acadian flag, with the blue, red, and white of the French flag, 3 fleur-de-lis, a common French symbol, a yellow castle representing the Spanish kingdom of Castile, as Spain let the Acadians migrate to Louisiana, and a yellow star, which was present in the flag of Acadia. In other parts of Spanish Lower Louisiana, especially New Orleans, the colony continued to be a melting pot of different immigrants and cultures. Already home to large French, Black, Native American, and German populations, Spanish settlers came to the colony as well, bringing their language and traditions with them. Most of the Spanish settlers in Louisiana were from the Canary Islands, a large island chain owned by Spain off the coast of Morocco. These Canarians, known in Louisiana as Isleños, trace their ancestry back to the Spanish and the Guanche, the native North African people of the Canary Islands. A number of Isleño towns were founded in Louisiana, and Spanish rule and settlement of the colony added to its role as a unique cultural meeting point. Europeans born in the colony were known as criollos, a word that changed over time to Creole. In colonial Lower Louisiana, many French and Spanish married one another and often married or had children with Black and indigenous Louisianans. Over time, a group of people known as the Creoles emerged, tracing their ancestry back to both French and Spanish colonists, enslaved people brought to the colony from Africa, and the region's native people, or some combination of these and other immigrant groups to the colony. Similar to the Cajuns, the Creoles became a distinct group with their own food, music, traditions, and dialect of French called Louisiana Creole. Living in much of southeastern Louisiana, in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and rural areas surrounding the cities, as well as further north in places like Natchitoches, there is a lot of overlap between Creoles and Cajuns, with many Louisianans today having ancestry from both groups. The Louisiana Creoles also have their own flag, with 4 different sections representing the diverse ancestry of the ethnic group. The flags of Mali and Senegal, where many of the enslaved people brought to Louisiana came from, as well as a French fleur-de-lis and a Castilian castle representing Spain. Many immigrants to Creole and Cajun regions often assimilated into Cajun and Creole culture. Many Louisiana Creoles practiced a unique religion called voodoo, though in recent years it has often been negatively stereotyped and at the same time used to attract tourists. Voodoo is a real religion that developed in New Orleans from both French and Spanish Catholic influences, as well as those from traditional African religions, and impacted by leaders like the famous voodoo queen Marie Laveau. Despite the colony's large multi-ethnic and multiracial population, Black people in Louisiana were severely discriminated against under French, Spanish, and later American rule, and for most of its history it was dominated by slavery. When Spain took over from France, for example, enslaved Black people made up 55% of Louisiana's entire population. Spanish Louisiana's eastern neighbors, Britain's North American possessions, had become independent not long after the French and Indian War, founding the United States and expanding west, and Florida was given back to Spain from Britain. At the same time, France was growing more powerful, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, who established imperial control of the country. Napoleon asked for Louisiana back from Spain and they returned it, with the colony becoming French again after decades of Spanish rule. However, things weren't looking great for a French presence on the continent. A slave revolt in the French island colony of Saint-Domingue, led by Toussaint Louverture, became a full-fledged revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the French were losing. In a few years, the revolutionaries would win, founding the second independent country in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti. With war looming in Europe and impending defeat in Haiti, Napoleon decided to cut his losses on the continent and focus his resources on Europe, offering U.S. President Thomas Jefferson sale of Louisiana to the United States. With the $11 million Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the U.S. doubled in size overnight as the massive French colony became the Louisiana Territory. Not long after, the heavily populated Lower Louisiana was split off of the Louisiana Territory as the Orleans Territory. In Orleans, border disputes to both the east and west with Spanish-controlled Tejas and West Florida remained despite the purchase. West Florida, across the Mississippi from the Orleans Territory, had, just like the area around New Orleans, been colonized by the French as well as the Spanish, and was culturally very connected to the Orleans Territory, sitting not far from New Orleans. Many Americans settled in Spanish West Florida, including in Mississippi River cities like Baton Rouge, and after disagreements with the Spanish government led a quick revolution, declaring an independent country in the western half of the colony called the Republic of West Florida. Supported by the United States, the country existed for less than 3 months before they were annexed by the U.S. West Florida's successful independence and annexation inspired movements by other American settlers in parts of New Spain such as Tejas, which became independent and later part of the U.S. as Texas. Texas's flag is even based off of the Lone Star flag of West Florida. During the Haitian Revolution, many refugees fled from Haiti to Louisiana, which was relatively close by and with a significant French heritage and large French-speaking population, along with a large Black population, had strong cultural similarities to Haiti. These waves of early Haitian immigration strongly influenced the Orleans Territory and its culture, impacting its food, dialect, and religion, with these new immigrants adding to the French-speaking population and many practicing voodoo. Often more recently connected to Africa than the enslaved people of Orleans who had been there for generations, these Haitian immigrants also brought with them a resurgence of African culture. Though sitting significantly further west of and not bordered by any U.S. state, the Orleans Territory was heavily populated, economically important, and growing fast. On April 30th, 1812, it changed its name to Louisiana and was admitted to the Union as the 18th state. Not long after, the Louisiana Territory, sitting to the north, changed its name to the Missouri Territory, and a section of West Florida north of Lake Pontchartrain, including Baton Rouge, was added to the new state. Following statehood, many American settlers from the rest of the United States began moving into the large state, joining the diverse population that was already there. The north of the state especially drew a large number of American settlers, many of whom were of Irish or English ancestry. This led to a cultural divide in the state, with southern Louisiana more influenced by French and northern Louisiana English speakers. Less than 2 months after statehood, the U.S. was at war with Britain, called the War of 1812. In 1815, as part of the war, Britain tried to take control of Louisiana but was soundly defeated by American forces at the Battle of New Orleans, a famous battle that brought Andrew Jackson national fame. Especially in its early years, the state's population was on the smaller side, yet at the same time had one of the largest enslaved populations in the country. At the outbreak of the Civil War, surpassed by only 5 other states. In 1860, 47% of all Louisianans were enslaved, forced to grow crops like sugarcane, cotton, rice, and tobacco. A deep South state that was dominated by slavery, Louisiana seceded from the Union on January 26, 1861, after Abraham Lincoln was elected president and joined the Confederacy. Several thousand Louisianans died in the war. The Mississippi proved essential for the Union. Union troops cut south down the river, slicing control of the Confederacy in half. Following the war, Louisiana was readmitted to the Union, and under Reconstruction, had the country's first ever black governor, PBS Pinchback. Pinchback was the only black American to serve as governor during Reconstruction, and the country's only black governor for over 100 years after that. After the end of Reconstruction, Union troops left Louisiana, and state politicians, many of whom were former Confederates, enacted racist policies called Jim Crow laws that severely restricted the rights and freedoms of black and multiracial Louisianans, segregating schools, restaurants, public transit, and public spaces, and making it nearly impossible for black Louisianans to vote. Many black people were murdered in racist lynchings in the state. In fact, more black people were lynched in Louisiana than all but 3 other states. On top of that, slavery was replaced by an exploitative system of farming called sharecropping, which often kept black Louisianans working at the same plantations they had before emancipation, making very little money. During the World Wars, many people left industrial and manufacturing jobs in northern cities to go serve overseas. That, coupled with the fact that so much more industrial output was needed for the war, opened up many job opportunities in the north. Fleeing racial discrimination and poverty, many black Louisianans left the state, heading north and west to industrial cities, many in the Midwest and on the West Coast, as part of the Great Migration. In 1900, 47% of Louisianans were black. By 1970, that number was down under 30%. Only 4 states saw higher proportions of their black population leave during the Great Migration. The state played an important role in the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a major civil rights organization, was founded in New Orleans, and in 1960, Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old girl in New Orleans, bravely desegregated her formerly all-white school, drawing national attention. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, natural resources were discovered in the state that would transform its economy. First came salt, often found in large salt domes near the Gulf, that would become essential to another industry, oil. In the early 1900s, state politics were dominated by one man, Governor then Senator Huey Long, nicknamed the Kingfish. Popular and at the same time very controversial, Long was a populist, considered by many a demagogue. He enacted popular policies and gained a large following of supporters, yet at the same time took almost sole control of the state, and many considered his power over the Louisiana government to be near dictatorial. In 1935, he was planning to run for president, but was assassinated in the Louisiana state capital. One of the lowest lying states in the country, and with significant parts of its land, including its largest city, sitting beneath sea level, Louisiana faces major threats from floods, hurricanes, and other natural disasters, as well as rising seas. Though it's become politicized, the greenhouse effect is very real, and Louisiana is losing land quite rapidly. In 2005, disasters struck the state. Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana in August, and destroyed many of the levees holding back the river and canals from the city. Because New Orleans was almost entirely at or even below sea level, destruction of the levees caused disastrous flooding. Homes were destroyed, millions lost electricity, and nearly 2,000 people were killed, though the number could be even higher. It was the 3rd deadliest storm in US history, and the deadliest the country's seen in nearly 100 years. Over 1 million people fled New Orleans, and much of the city was destroyed. The low-lying and already poverty-stricken 9th Ward saw widespread destruction in particular. Damage to infrastructure, coupled with a slow government response that was widely criticized, caused problems well beyond the initial storm itself. Many people died in the days following the hurricane simply because they were out of food or water. In 2010, another disaster occurred. An explosion occurred on the Deepwater Horizon, an oil rig 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana near the mouth of the Mississippi. The explosion on the rig, which was drilling for oil company BP, killed 11 people and caused one of the largest oil spills in world history, spilling anywhere from 130 to 210 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. A horrific environmental disaster. Courts found BP liable for the explosion and the deaths and spill it caused due to carelessness, and they were charged with a number of crimes, having to pay what became the largest legal settlement a company has ever paid in US history. Another disaster, this one quite strange, occurred in 1980. Salt domes, huge columns of salt that would push up under the ground, creating outcroppings like Avery Island, are important in the oil industry, often trapping oil beneath them. One of these domes, under a lake called Lake Penior, collapsed and caved in after Texaco drilled into an existing salt mine. The water poured into the salt dome, ripping out the lake floor and causing a canal that connected it to the Gulf to flow backwards, filling with a mix of salt water and fresh water, and creating a 164-foot waterfall that lasted for 2 days until the now much larger lake refilled. Though once dependent on agriculture, modern Louisiana is today dominated by the extraction and processing of natural resources, as well as the shipping industry. Oil and natural gas are huge in Louisiana. Northern Louisiana is filled with oil wells and offshore rigs line the Gulf. It's the 9th largest producer of crude oil in the country, and the 3rd largest of natural gas, with nearly 10% of all natural gas in the US coming from Louisiana. On top of that, the Pelican State is home to 19 oil refineries, more than any state besides Texas, and 3 of the 10 largest oil refineries in the country are in Louisiana. country's third largest sitting on the Mississippi in Garyville. Many are in or right next to some of the state's largest cities. Lake Charles is the country's 7th largest oil refinery, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana's capital and 2nd largest city, has the country's 5th largest refinery, right next to downtown and the Louisiana Capitol building. Most of the refineries sit right along the Mississippi River, as do a number of massive chemical plants and factories. Oil and chemicals can be transported in bulk by ship, so placing refineries in the river gives easy access not only to the oil fields of Texas and Louisiana, but access upstream into the rest of the world from the Gulf. At the mouth of the Mississippi, Louisiana has always been a crucial part of national and global trade and shipping, and the state's home to 5 of the 12 busiest ports in the United States. Lake Charles is the country's 12th busiest port, the parish of Plaquemines the 10th busiest, Baton Rouge the 9th, and New Orleans the 7th. The busiest port in the entire country, getting more shipping than cities like New York or Los Angeles, is the port of South Louisiana, which stretches along the river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Not only oil, but grain and other agricultural products are often shipped out from these Mississippi River ports, as the river connects Louisiana to much of the agricultural South, Midwest, and Great Plains further upstream, making it one of the only routes goods can be shipped out of the country's interior. Despite its economic significance, Louisiana faces major struggles with poverty. Even though it was nearly 2 decades ago, the devastation wrought by Katrina made things even worse, intensifying already enormous challenges with poverty. It is the 4th lowest median household income in the United States and the 2nd highest poverty rate, surpassed only by its neighbor Mississippi. 19% of the state, nearly 1 in 5 Louisianans, lives below the poverty line. The large oil and chemical refineries that dominate the state's economy are very lightly taxed, meaning that very little of the money made in Louisiana goes to public services. There's a very insightful video on this phenomenon called Why Louisiana Stays Poor by Together Louisiana that I highly recommend watching if you're interested. With this comes many other problems. It's the most polluted state in the US, which makes sense. Many of these large plants and refineries sit right in the middle of major cities. With the high rates of poverty come issues with crime. The state has the 6th highest violent crime rate in the country, and New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport all have some of the largest problems with crime in the US. It also has the unfortunate designation of having the largest maximum security prison in the country, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, or Angola. With all these challenges, the state receives a significant amount of money from the federal government, more than it contributes itself, and is among the states most highly dependent on federal funding. Louisiana's largest city is New Orleans, nicknamed the Crescent City. With 899,000 people, it's the 49th most populous urban area in the country, and it's among the most famous cities in the world. Tourists flock to the city, over 19 million people a year, many for Mardi Gras, a 2-week-long celebration leading up to the Christian season of Lent, has become synonymous with the city, and involves lots of floats and parades, beads, extravagant costumes, and drinking, as well as food like king cake. The city is really the last significant population center before the Mississippi meets the Gulf, and sitting between the river and Lake Pontchartrain, much of it lies at or even below sea level. Because of this, the groundwater is so high that its cemeteries are above ground. Instead of tombstones, coffins are placed in above ground vaults, so it's almost like you're walking through a city of the dead. They're just one beautiful and distinctive part of the old historic city. It's famed for its architecture, with long, thin shotgun houses, as well as many buildings with ornate balconies. The French Quarter is the most famous part of the city, filled with history, old beautiful architecture, and well known for its nightlife and party scene, especially on Bourbon Street. Jackson Square and the iconic St. Louis Cathedral, the country's oldest Catholic cathedral, is the heart of the neighborhood, and downtown is home to most of the state's tallest buildings, such as the Hancock Whitney Center, Louisiana's tallest, and it's home to colleges like Tulane University. Paddle wheel boats chug down the river, bringing tourists through the city, while major ports ship out grain, produce, salt, and oil to the rest of the world. New Orleans has had a major influence on the country's music. Jazz was created by black musicians in the city, and iconic jazz performers like Louis Armstrong were from there, and the city to this day has a major jazz scene. Though a popular and iconic city, it has had its fair share of problems, high poverty and crime, as well as a precarious geographic location, one responsible for its success, but with rising seas and the ever-present threat of natural disasters, it is proving to be a large problem as well. In fact, with the weight of all these buildings and roads on a fairly unstable surface, the city is actually sinking 2 inches each year. Despite its issues, New Orleans is a city unlike any other that has shaped Louisiana into the American anomaly it is today. Baton Rouge is the 2nd largest city in the state. With 594,000 people in its urban area, it's the 68th largest in the country. It sits in southern Louisiana, on the east bank of the Mississippi upstream from New Orleans. It's Louisiana's capital city, home to a capitol building very different from most others. It's a skyscraper. At 450 feet, it's the tallest state capitol building in the country and one of the tallest buildings in the state. Louisiana's old capital, also in the city, is designed to look like a castle. The city is a small downtown with a few skyscrapers, but not nearly as many as New Orleans. It's also a college town. Louisiana State University, or LSU, is in the city, and is the largest college in the state by far. As I mentioned earlier, it's home to a huge refinery, one of the largest on Earth, the Baton Rouge Refinery, owned by ExxonMobil, just north of downtown. Louisiana's third largest urban area is Shreveport, on the Red River in the northwestern part of the state, and home to 298,000 people in its urban area. It's a small city but has a decently sized downtown. Once a major center of the oil industry, it today has a large military presence, home to Barksdale Air Force Base, and has recently become a casino town, with a number of casinos popping up along the river. Louisiana is one of the most culturally distinct states in the US. The northern half of the state is culturally much like the rest of the South, whereas the southern part has heavy French influences. Different groups unique to the state like the Cajuns and Creoles, as well as influence from Native Americans, Africa, Spain, Britain, Haiti, the Caribbean, Germany, and many other places and peoples, have shaped Louisiana significantly. The influence of so many cultures and regions can be seen in the state's food, which is perhaps the most regionally unique food in the US. Cajun and Creole foods see influences from Africa, France, and Spain come together in dishes known for their spice, and have become popular around the country. The cultural melting pot that Louisiana has been throughout its history has resulted in famous dishes like jambalaya, made with rice, vegetables, and meat, usually shrimp, chicken, or sausage, andouille and boudin sausage are both popular in Louisiana cooking. Gumbo is a famous thick stew made with a dark roux, rice, meat, often shrimp, chicken, or sausage, sometimes with okra, and sometimes with dried ground sassafras leaves. There are different ways to make it, but it's a very popular and famous dish in and outside the state. Dirty rice is rice cooked with meat, vegetables, and spices, and a po' boy is a Louisiana staple, a sandwich made with New Orleans French bread, a light bread that's crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, and typically filled with fried seafood. Seafood and shellfish in general, like shrimp, crawfish, crab, oysters, catfish, to name a few, are very popular. Beignets are a delicious deep-fried doughy pastry with powdered sugar on top. There are so many other iconic Louisiana foods like red beans and rice, muffaletta, king cake, and so on. The state is truly known for its delicious food. On top of that, I found many of the place names in the state to be some of the most difficult and confusing to pronounce in the country, and I'm sorry if I butchered some of them, I'm sure I did, due in part to the state's unique culture and heritage, and especially the heavy French influence. The state has very distinctive accents and dialects that stand out from the rest of the South, and change depending on where in the state you're from, such as New Orleans or Acadiana. Racially, it's a very diverse state. 58.3% of Louisianans are white, 31.9% are black, the second highest proportion of any state besides Mississippi, 5.2% are Latino, and 1.7% are Asian American. The state has some of the most French Americans in the country, with 16.2% of Louisianans having French ancestry, more than 5 times the national average. It's surpassed in sheer numbers by only California, and in percentage by just 4 New England states. Religiously, the state is an outlier. It sits in the Deep South, the most heavily Protestant part of the country, yet is among the most Catholic states in the US. 26% of Louisianans are Catholics, making it the largest single denomination, though 53% belong to a Protestant denomination. The strong Catholic presence is part of the historic French and Spanish influence on the state. French and languages based off of it, like Louisiana French and Louisiana Creole, have a fairly large speaker base in the state, mostly among Cajuns and Creoles. Though efforts in the past to anglicize the state's French-speaking communities have shrunk the numbers, 4.5% of Louisianans speak French, compared to just 0.3% of the US overall. Major colleges in the state include LSU in Baton Rouge and Tulane in New Orleans. Major companies include Tabasco on Avery Island, Raising Cane's Chicken Fingers, CenturyLink, and Entergy. Its largest newspaper is the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Its busiest airport is the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. Louisiana has had a professional football and basketball team, both in New Orleans, the NFL's New Orleans Saints and NBA's New Orleans Pelicans. Many famous people are from Louisiana, including Louis Armstrong, Reese Witherspoon, Odell Beckham Jr., Tyler Perry, NBA Youngboy, Eli and Peyton Manning, DJ Khaled, Lil Wayne, Bill Russell, Truman Capote, Britney Spears, Carl Weathers, and many more. No presidents were born in Louisiana, but Zachary Taylor lived in Baton Rouge for many years before the White House. Politically, Louisiana is very conservative. It's a red state heavily favoring the Republican Party, and has a Cook Partisan Voting Index, or PVI, of R+12, meaning that in a given year, Republicans do about 12% better in Louisiana than in the country on average. Out of its 6 representatives in the House, 5 are Republicans and 1 is a Democrat. Both of its senators, John Kennedy and Bill Cassidy, are Republicans, but it's one of just 3 deep red states whose governor is a Democrat. John Bel Edwards is a moderate, arguably conservative Democrat, something you rarely see in the party, especially in major elected office, but it allows him to be elected in such a deep red state. That is it for Louisiana. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through you can access different things such as behind the scenes videos, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, ad-free content and shoutouts on my videos such as these. Please be sure to check out the TII store where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. One of the products that I'm most excited about are these limited edition frame state prints that commemorate each video in US Explained. These are available as soon as the corresponding US Explained video is uploaded, but only 10 of each will be released, so make sure to buy one before they go out of stock. Right now you'll be able to buy a Louisiana state print, so please click the link in the description and go pay a visit to the TII store. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I'll use in all of the US Explained videos and did the editing, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Louisiana who helped give me information for this video, leaving detailed and informative comments on YouTube as well as Discord. I truly would not have been able to make this video without your help. My next video in the series will be on Indiana, so get excited. I really appreciate the well over 700 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord server yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about the topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information about upcoming states in the series. It's a great community and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the description. Thank you for watching this video and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.